I'm Cliff, and this is my garage. My first HPDE is coming up next week, so it's time to flush. No, not that flush. Hey, welcome back to the garage. And if this is your first time joining me, thanks for dropping by. I'm getting the Cayman ready for its first HPDE, and one of the first steps is going to be flushing the brake fluid. While I'm doing this for an HPDE with racing fluid, the same procedure applies for just about any car using standard fluid. Oh, and if you don't know what HPDE is, check out this suggested video link up here in this corner. PCA standards, as with many HPDE organizers, requires that you have completely flushed and replaced the brake fluid within the previous 12 months. Now, the reason for this is that the brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means that it absorbs water right out of the air. And the way that brakes work is that you press on the brake pedal, which pushes on a piston that pushes the fluid down the brake lines, and that pushes the pistons out on the calipers. Those calipers then compress the brake pads onto the rotors, and that's what stops the car. So the brake fluid acts like a long, flexible, incompressible rod between the brake pedal and the caliper. In normal circumstances, water in the brake fluid isn't a problem because water doesn't compress any better than brake fluid. The problem comes up when the brake calipers get really hot. Then that water in the brake fluid turns into steam, which is compressible, and now your brakes feel all soft and squishy and don't work so good anymore. So when you're going to be out on the racetrack and using your brakes a lot, it's a really good idea to completely replace your brake fluid and make sure that you don't have any water in the fluid or in the lines in the brake fluid. It's important to note that towing a camper or trailer in the mountains can really stress and overheat your brakes also. So regular replacement is just as important even when you're not driving around a high-performance sports car or you're out on the track. I'm not only going to be replacing the brake fluid in the Cayman, I'm going to replace it with a special high-performance brake fluid. Under a lot of heavy braking, the calipers can get so hot that even uncontaminated brake fluid can boil. If you look at the label, any brake fluid gives you a boiling temperature or a boiling point. Actually, it has two boiling points. One is the dry boiling point, which is the temperature at which it will boil when it's brand new. In other words, it hasn't had a chance to absorb any water out of the air. The wet boiling point is the temperature at which it will boil when it's absorbed 3.7% water by volume, which is typically takes 1 to 2 years. And that's why it's recommended that you replace your brake fluid at most every 2 years and preferably every year. On a side note, I have no idea why they chose 3.7%. My guess is that it's because that's the average water absorption after 2 years or something like that. I'm going to be replacing the current brake fluid with Castrol SRF racing brake fluid. While normal brake fluid has a dry boiling point of around 450 degrees, Castrol SRF has a boiling point of almost 600 degrees. Now, you may be thinking, why not just use a high temperature brake fluid all the time in every car? Well, in everyday driving with normal cars, your brakes are never going to get hot enough to boil normal brake fluid. And there's the fact that normal brake fluid costs like $8 or $10 a quart, whereas Castrol SRF, $75 a quart. To flush the fluid, you need to move the old fluid through the brake lines while filling the reservoir with new fluid, one brake caliper at a time, until the new fluid has completely replaced the old fluid. And there are several ways to do that. Now, if you have a helper, you can just have them sit in the car and pump on the brakes over and over again to move the fluid. just because you're pushing that piston over and over again. Now, if you have two helpers, the second one can be watching the reservoir and constantly putting in new fluid so that you don't have to do that running back and forth between the caliper and the reservoir. If you do have to do this job on your own, you can either use a pressure system or a vacuum system to help you out and turn it into a one-man DIY job. With a pressure system, you hook it up to the brake fluid reservoir and then you pump up the pressure, and that pressure pushes on the brake fluid, and then you go to the caliper and you release the pressure at the caliper to drain the fluid so that the pressure is pushing new fluid all the way through the system. Now, these systems are pretty common, but it means you have to keep going back and forth between the caliper and the reservoir to keep pumping up the pressure on the pressure pot that's on there. Another option is a vacuum system, which is what I have here. In this case, we put a large feeder bottle on the brake fluid reservoir to keep putting new brake fluid in as we drain it off. Then you put this catch can on the caliper itself. The catch can uses air pressure and a Venturi effect in this little section right here to generate a vacuum on the bottle. And that pulls the fluid through the line. Other than making sure that you don't run out of fluid in the feeder bottle, you don't have to keep running back and forth between the reservoir over and over again. The only downside is that it makes a little noise. Okay, let's start setting this up. Normally, you always start at the wheel that's furthest away from the reservoir, but there are some cars where there's some other order. Check your car's service manual to make sure of how you're supposed to do it, which wheel comes first, second, etc. On the Cayman, the brake fluid reservoir is right under this little panel here. And first thing, let's take a look at this. This is the fill cap right here. And on the Cayman, the indicator of whether or not it's full is over here on the side. There's a little arrow. It's kind of tough to see. On every brake reservoir, there's an indicator that shows how full the brake reservoir should be. And on the Cayman, it's really kind of hard to see. There's a little arrow right here on the side, and then you can see where the brake fluid is right up to that level. So this is nice and full. I have no idea what this is. It appears to be a 1215, which I suppose that could be a note of the last time the brake fluid was changed, which is A, a terribly long time, and B, who's dumb enough to write with permanent marker on here the date that's going to happen over and over again if you're doing proper maintenance? I don't know. Now, before we get too far along, what we want to do is come around here and just kind of tuck some paper towels. You want to be really careful with brake fluid. This stuff is, well, it's poisonous, but it's also extremely caustic. It's a phenomenally good paint remover, so you don't want to get it on anything that's painted. And we just set this paper towel right here to catch any drips that we mistakenly do. So unscrew the lid and just kind of set it right here. Inside here, there's a little filler cap, or not filler cap, a filter cap, filter cup. And it's kind of a pain to get out. I just like to get right under it with a little screwdriver, and it pops right out. Set that on there and just very carefully move it over here into my work cart so that it's out of the way. The first step is to actually remove as much of the fluid from the reservoir as we can, because there's no point in pushing all this through the brake lines for no reason. Now, you can use something like a turkey baster or a syringe to reach in there and suck this fluid out and put it into, some kind of container for disposal. But since we've got our own little vacuum here already and it has a hose designed just to do that, we'll put that to work. Just put the end in here, turn on the vacuum or turn on the air pressure, and that'll cause the vacuum, and then we just pull the fluid right out of here. Again, being careful because this stuff is nasty. Now we're going to take the fill bottle and we're going to fill it up with the Castrol SRF. Of course, make sure the cap is good and tight. And also notice there's a little slot here in the side of this tube. And what that's going to do is when the fluid level gets down low enough to expose that slot, then a little bit of air will blurp up into the what is this called? The jar, and I'll release a little bit more fluid into the reservoir. Making sure that this valve is closed first, we tip it over into the opening and clamp the bottle to the lip or the rim of the reservoir, making sure it's steady, and then we open the valve. And you can see and hear it gurgling as the initial batch goes into the reservoir. Now do sit here and keep an eye on it, because you don't want the feed stop system to fail. It'll fill it up to a certain point and then it'll stop. It should stop. Let's hope it stops. Okay, it stopped. Let's start by taking off the right rear tire. And if you've got a car that has lug bolts instead of lug nuts like I do here, do yourself a favor and make your life easier and get a couple of these wheel stud hangers. You remove the top two bolts and you replace them with these studs. And now you remove the rest of the wheel studs. You don't have to worry about the wheel turning loose and falling off on you as you remove the bolts. Just comes loose, easy peasy. And when you're putting it back on, it's so much easier than trying to fight with getting the bolt holes lined up and getting it back on the alignment hub. Really super simple. I'll give you a link to the ones that I use in the video description below. It's a full set of 4 different sizes, or you can just get the single size here. I forget off the top of my head what they are, but I'll let you know that probably in a little pop-up thing here on the video. There are 2 actual drains or drain fittings on this brake caliper. And the line comes in and it splits here in the back inside the caliper. One part goes up to this drain, the other part comes around here and feeding this side of the caliper and coming out this drain right here. Now, what I've read is that you need to drain the inside one first, and the logic being that as it's coming in here, if you drain the outside one first, you're leaving fluid sitting here and it can kind of be pulled away and contaminating the fluid the new fluid that you're pulling in. So, but if you drain this one first, then any that's left right there is going to go ahead and get pulled out and drained out this one here. So I'm not sure exactly how much difference that makes, if it's really worth bothering with, but I'm going to drain the inside drain first. Each drain has a little rubber cap on it. Sometimes they'll just come off easily by just pulling on them. Other times you have to encourage them a little bit with something like a screwdriver. This one, I guess you have to encourage it a lot. And now we'll go ahead and pop the back one. Okay. And the way you drain these, or the way you open them, is to use an end wrench. In this case, this is an 11 millimeter, and it just goes on here, and you open it a little bit, you start the draining, and when you finish draining, you just close it back off and tighten it down. Don't get crazy with tightening it because you don't want to damage it. I've changed over to this hose that has this fitting here that's designed to hook onto the drain. So just take the wrench and get it onto the fitting first and then put this little fitting right over it. And then we turn on the vacuum and pull it out. One thing to note is that I did empty the catch can because we need to know how much fluid we've pulled out. You want to pull out all the fluid in the line and make sure that you've got fresh fluid throughout the entire thing. The problem is, how do you know how much fluid to take out? Now, what you see a lot of times is people will tell you, oh, well, just keep going until the fluid changes color, until you see like the fluid in this hose change color. Well, the problem is if you've done a good job, and you've been good with your maintenance, and you've been changing the fluid regularly, the color is not going to be all that different between the old and new fluid. So you need to figure out how much fluid needs to be pulled or how much fluid is in that line. And in the case of the Cayman here, after a little bit of research, on the back right wheel, the one furthest from the reservoir, it says to drain about 300 milliliters, or about a third of a liter. So this catch can has markings on it of the volume, and I'm going to use that as a guide to pull the right amount of fluid. Making sure I got a good tight seal, and then crack the line open, or crack the fitting open, and start the vacuum. Okay, there comes the fluid. One thing I forgot to mention is that I'm going to pull half of the 300 millimeters out of this side and then half out of the other. Okay, that's about half. So, get a paper towel in here to catch any drips coming out. Oh, sorry. First, lock this closed. Now pull the suction fitting off. Make sure I got this good and tight. And now we'll move to the inside fitting, which is considerably easier to get to. Crack it open. Make sure I put the back cap on, and we finish off the process. Okay, third of a liter pulled out. Same as last time, we just take it, tighten that fitting back up. And then as I pull it off, I like to just put some vacuum on it to try and suck up anything that's not trying to drip off. Now that we've finished up the rear passenger side, draining 0.3 liters, next we go to the rear driver's side where we drain 0.25 liters, the front passenger side where we drain 0.15 liters, and then we finish off with the front driver's side where we only drain 0.1 liters. Now keep in mind that the capacity of the entire system is only 0.45 liters, but we're over draining each corner to make sure we get out every bit that we can of the old brake fluid. Here's an interesting little thing that happened. Remember I told you about how caustic brake fluid is? When I was taking this all apart, a little bit of it dripped over on where that Sharpie permanent marker had been used to write something on here. I wiped at it, and the Sharpie marker was completely gone. This is not something to be messed with. Okay, all done. All that's left to do is to take her out for a little test drive, make sure that everything's working, and then we're good to go. Now, before you leave, please go down there, find that thumbs up button, and give me a like on the video. And while you're down there, click on that big red subscribe button. It doesn't cost a thing. It doesn't hurt a bit. And trust me, I think you'll enjoy it. And finally, if you want to keep up with everything that I'm doing here in the garage, including the rest of my prep for my first HPDE or the new mini split DIY AC and heating system I'm putting in, or all the other things going on around here in the garage, go find that the bell icon and give it a click. That turns on notifications for this channel, and that way YouTube will let you know every time that I post something new from here in Cliff's Garage. I'll see you next time.